All right, who is ready for the second part of chapter 6? Finding out what happened to Jane. Remember, she was really not happy with her brother and sisters because they liked Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith took them to dinner and then came home to their house and played with them and all of that. And she is not happy because she's thinking he wants to take the place of their father, which Jane was the only one that really remembered their dad. So she thought they had gone completely and utterly insane. Do you want this, stepfather stepping in and butting in? And they all were like, well, I need a dad. I need, it would be nice. And then she got so upset. And then she says, oh, it's no use. You don't understand. I wish. She broke off in alarm, remembering the charm. Then, a prey to utter recklessness, she plunged her hand into her pocket, grasped the charm firmly, and went on, yes, I do. I wish I belonged to some other family. I wish it twice. Mark and Catherine and Martha gasped. This was the worst thing that had happened yet. They hardly dared look at Jane, for fear she might start turning into someone else before their eyes. But when they did look, there stood the same brown-haired, blue-eyed, snub-nosed Jane they had grown to know and love through the years. Nothing seemed to have happened. Maybe nothing had. Mark decided to find out. Look here, old Janus, he said, putting his hand on her arm and using a pet name that was reserved for unusual serious moments. You didn't mean it, did you? You let me go, you bully! Remarked a prim, ladylike voice none of the children had ever heard before in their lives. You horrid big boy! I don't like boys and I don't like you! Oh, cried Martha, turning pale. She doesn't know us. Of course she does, said Catherine. You know me, don't you, dear? Kathy, that you've been through thick and thin with. No, I don't know you and I don't wish to. Your frock is soiled, said the voice that, to their horror, seemed to be coming out of Jane. My mamma told me never to play with strange children. Martha began to sniff. What an insanitary little girl, said the voice. Tell her to use a handkerchief. She'll give me a germ. Oh, what's the matter with her? Martha's voice rose to a wail. It's not her fault, Catherine said, trying to be reassuring for Martha's sake. It's the way she's been brought up, I suppose, by that other family she belongs to now. It does show what a good influence we've been, doesn't it? She was lots nicer under our tender care. I don't believe it, said Mark. She's just trying to fool us, aren't you, Janus? Don't call me that, said the voice. That's not my name. All right, then, said Mark, turning on her suddenly. If that isn't your name, what is? The strange girl, who looked like Jane yet was no longer Jane, seemed startled for a moment, as if she weren't quite sure of the answer. Then her face cleared. My mother calls me her little comfort, she said. Mark made a gagging noise. Catherine looked disgusted. To think one of us should have come to this, she mourned. It would be an errand of mercy to put the poor thing out of her misery, Mark agreed. She, who was no longer Jane, was staring around the room. I don't like this house, she said. The furnishings are in poor taste. It's gaudy. Her lower lip began to tremble. I want to go home. Oh, you do you? Said Mark. Well, I can fix that. No sooner said than done. And he made a dive for the pocket where he knew the charm lay concealed. But she, who was no longer Jane, pulled away and gave him a surprisingly hard slap for such a miminy-piminy ladylike type. Take that, she cried. You are a thief as well as a bully. She glared round at them all. You are a lot of badly brought up children. You kidnapped me and then tried to rob me. I'm going to tell my mother. And with these words, she flounced out into the hall and started down the stairs. By the time the others had recovered from their shock and dashed after her, she was in the act of mincing out the front door. Mark and Catherine took the stairs 3 at a time. Martha used the banister. But in the lower hall, Miss Bick leaped forth and barred the way. No, you don't, she said. Not a soul leaves this house until the table's set for lunch. There was nothing the children could do about this, and nothing that they felt prepared to say. They didn't even point out that Jane had already left. As Catherine said afterwards, the way Jane was acting right then, she probably didn't have a soul. But never was table set with such wild abandon. Never did silver fly through the air with such great ease as it then flew. Hardly more than one precious minute had been wasted in idle drudgery before Mark and Catherine and Martha rushed out the front door and down the steps onto the sidewalk and stood scanning the offing in all directions. Far down Maplewood Avenue, they could just make out a genteel figure in Jane's dress, picking its way along and toeing out in a way that the real Jane would have scorned to be seen doing in public. As they watched, the figure turned to the right into Virginia Street. And as they started to dash after it, a car drove up before the house, and Mr. Smith got out and held the door open for their mother. "Company for lunch," their mother called, blushing pink and looking embarrassed and pretty. "Where's Jane?" The three children looked at each other and then quickly looked away again. "We don't know exactly," said Catherine. "We think she's visiting somebody over on Virginia Street," said Mark, hoping that he spoke the truth and that she, who was all that was left of Jane, had not strayed farther. "Well, go and get her," said their mother, taking some interesting-looking packages from the car. "This is a party." The three children looked at the ground hopelessly. "Oh, wait," their mother went on, not noticing. "You all go in the car and pick her up. That'll be quicker. I'll be breaking the news to Miss Bick about the party." And she started toward the house, her arms loaded with packages. Mark and Catherine and Martha waited till she was safely inside. Then they turned to Mr. Smith and all started to speak at once. Then they stopped and looked at each other again. "Shall we tell him?" Catherine asked. "Yes," Mark said, nodded decisively. "There comes a time in the affairs of men, and this is it." "I said we ought to all along," said Martha. "I said he'd know what to do. This'll prove it." And she and Mark and Catherine all piled into the front seat of the car and began telling Mr. Smith about the dread events of the morning. They didn't go into the reason for Jane's upset, though, or the way she felt about stepfathers, out of consideration for his feelings. And Mr. Smith didn't waste time in unnecessary questions, which proves, said Mark to Catherine afterwards, that he would make an ideal step and not Murdstone at all. He started the motor, and the car shot down Maplewood and turned into Virginia Street. She, who was no longer Jane, was no longer to be seen. "She must be in this block somewhere," said Catherine. "She hasn't had time to walk any farther." "What do we do now?" asked Martha. "The question is moot," said Mark. "She could be in any one of these houses." "We could holler, 'Fire!' and everyone would come running out," suggested Catherine. "Let's not have any more fires or running," Martha shuddered, remembering certain past experiences. "Let's knock at all the doors and ask them if they want to subscribe to the Literary Digest." "That's no good," said Mark, who had done this one summer to try to earn spending money. "All they ever say is no and shut the door." Martha turned to Mr. Smith. "It's up to you," she said trustingly. Mr. Smith looked pleased and touched. He also looked a little nervous, as though he were hoping he might live up to their trust. He cleared his throat. "Well," he said, "first of all, does any of these houses look like the kind of house the family of that kind of girl would live in?" Mark and Catherine and Martha stared up and down the block. Luckily, it was a short one, with only 8 houses in it, 4 on each side of the street. Almost all the houses looked very much like their own, comfortable, slightly shabby family sort of houses with an easy-to-get-along-with lived-in look. All but one. The 8th house was made of cold-looking gray stone and sat primly on an impossibly neat emerald lawn that was shut off from the street by a forbidding hedge of green evergreens. A small sign on the lawn said, "Please." The walk to the front door was of bright blue gravel, edged with some boring plants that looked as though they had never blossomed and didn't intend to. There were no croquet wickets on the lawn and no bicycles or kiddie cars sitting around the way there were in the front of most of the other houses. "That's the one," Mark was positive. "It has to be. It looks just like her." He and Catherine and Martha and Mr. Smith got out of the car and advanced stealthily up the street till they stood confronting the gray stone house. No one was in sight. From within came the sound of someone practicing a difficult piece upon the piano. "That couldn't be Jane," said Martha. "She hates practice." "I bet she doesn't now," said Mark. Well, we're going to have to stop there, and we'll have to find out what happens tomorrow. So stay tuned for part 3 of chapter 6 and what happened to Jane. And is that her practicing? We'll see. All right. Have a great afternoon.